I move that I have leave to introduce a bill for an Act to amend the National Energy Retail Law, South Australia Act 2011.
Is that seconded? Yes, sir. That's seconded. Member for Narungga. Oh, sorry, I need to put that. All those in favour say aye, those against say no. I call it for the ayes. Member for Narungga. Oh, the clerk first.
A bill for an Act to amend the National Energy Retail Law, South Australia Act 2011.
Member for Narungga now.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. I rise to introduce this bill today as a follow-up action from the power outage that occurred on March 14. Now, astute listeners to this Parliament might well remember the fact that our region, my region, our community, has suffered from a power outage on Friday, March 14 that lasted for at least 20 hours. It's longer in some places, but at least 20 hours in all places, and it covered the entirety of the Yorke Peninsula, basically the whole of my electorate. And it was an extraordinary event, Mr Acting Speaker. It was something that I certainly don't recall having experienced in my lifetime, and it was something that had a profound impact both on the private residents of our electorate, as well as the business community. And I think that by and large, the feeling across the peninsula was that it was just simply not good enough. The fact that in this day and age, in 2025, we could suffer from an outage of 20 hours or more, really go without what is basically a human right in this day and age, electricity supply, was really quite an extraordinary thing. And since that time, of course, we have been fighting for compensation, because in the aftermath, when we finally had the lights back on, we could finally turn our computers back on, etc., it emerged that there was no compensatory scheme that was available to anyone in my electorate who had suffered any loss whatsoever as a result of this outage, which is really quite an extraordinary thing in my view, Mr Speaker. We rely on electricity more so than we ever have, for our phones to work, for our fridges to work, for the basic human right things that make our lives tick. We rely on electricity, and to be so profoundly let down on that day was really quite staggering, and then to have no repercussion, or seemingly at least no repercussions whatsoever, for those people that provide our electricity was an extraordinary thing, and really aggrieved the people who did suffer that loss in my electorate. There is, of course, a guaranteed service level scheme that operates for SA Power Networks. That is a scheme by which there are certain levels that must be met, and the initial level is 20 hours over the year without power. Once you can prove that you've gone 20 hours without power over the course of a year, you will become eligible for $100 in compensation. Well, I can tell you, Mr Acting Speaker, and I'm sure you're quite aware, that is an allowance, that is a compensation that will not go very far in covering the cost for some of these businesses that are out of pocket. What's worse than that, Mr Speaker, despite the paltry amount that was on offer under that scheme for our situation, it wasn't even applicable. Because this was deemed to be a transmission failure as opposed to a supply issue, and SAPN was not at fault and it was an Electranet issue, that guaranteed service level scheme was not even available to the people of my electorate. So they weren't able to get that. Further, there is a relatively new small claims compensation scheme, which this current government has introduced and trumpeted as a raging success, because it is designed to address a gap in the wider insurance market. Now, this is a scheme, and frankly, one that I would applaud as well, but this is a scheme that applies to energy users who use under 160 megawatts of electricity per year and would be able to claim compensation when a failure of SAPN's electricity infrastructure leads to a voltage variation that causes property damage or food spoilage. Now, this is a good scheme. This is something that when a consumer of electricity, through no fault of their own, suffers a voltage variation and their fridge is fried or their food spoils or whatever happens, they are eligible, whether or not SAPN is at fault, to claim compensation from this scheme. An excellent thing. But for the life of me, Mr Acting Speaker, I cannot understand why it doesn't extend to power outages. What is the difference for Joe Blow, a person on the ground, when it comes to the mode with which they have lost their fridge or lost their food or suffered their loss? What is the difference to them whether it is a power voltage or a power outage? If they go 20 hours without power and all their food in their fridge spoils, if they're a baker and all of their pastry is destroyed, what does it matter whether it's the fault of a power voltage or a power outage? So this bill that I'm introducing today will attempt to expand that scheme to more wide-reaching consequences so that it can include those things, so that when my community is facing a similar situation, if it does happen again, then there will be an avenue with which they can pursue compensation from the people that provide electricity. Because the excuse that we were given at the time was that it was an extraordinarily dry summer, which it was extraordinarily hot, it was windy, and the insulators that are critical to the success of the power network had become so dirty that it was triggering faults in the electricity. That may well be the case, but it has stayed dry. I'm not sure that we've cleared 200 mil of rain on the peninsula so far this winter. It is facing another dry summer, as best I can tell it, without being a meteorologist, and I'm almost fairly certain that those conditions will persist through summer, and we might well be facing the same circumstances that cause for the power to go out for 20 hours again when this summer rolls around. So it might well happen again. This scheme is important, and we need to take steps to do it. Now, I'm sure it can be done, Mr. Speaker, because Mr. Acting Speaker, I'm sure it can be done because it was managed to be done successfully everywhere else in the state of South Australia. As best I could tell over the summer, despite those dry conditions persisting in different parts of the state, on the Eyre Peninsula, in the Riverland, to a lesser degree on the Fleurieu, despite those dry conditions persisting down there, the power seemed to stay on. There wasn't, as far as I'm aware, another 20-hour outage that happened anywhere else in the state across South Australia over the summer. So the power companies have managed to successfully keep those power lines clean and on, and haven't subjected any other regions to extended outages like they had ours. And I'm sure that based on that fact, they can take that treatment that they've provided to other parts of the state and extend it to our network to ensure that that power stays on and we can continue to have it going forward. So I will be pushing that, and I'll be pushing this change in the scheme on behalf of my constituents, because a great deal many suffered significant loss on that Friday, March 14 event. And this extends, and I'd like to give a couple of examples, not every example that came to call me because we haven't the time, but a couple of examples, one of a business and one of a private individual who suffered loss, who I think should be eligible for some form of compensation. And if this scheme doesn't provide it, then perhaps it should be expanded to include them, but should be eligible for some form of compensation. The first is a gentleman called Adam Lobb, and Adam is reliant upon medication to sustain his life. And that is not an exaggeration. This is a fact of life that he needs medication to ensure that he can continue to live a happy and fruitful life. Now that medication needs to be refrigerated. It cannot exceed a certain temperature for fear of spoiling. So when the power went out for 20 hours, he was faced with a choice of sitting at home and crossing his fingers and hoping that it would come back on, hoping it would come back on in time to preserve that medication and ensure that it lasted, or packing up everything, driving to Adelaide or somewhere where the power was on, anywhere outside of our electorate basically, hoping the power was on, and whacking it in a fridge there and sitting outside of his home, outside of his comfort zone, outside of his community, waiting for the power to come back on, but safe in the knowledge that his medication was preserved and able to be used. Now, he did pack up to Adelaide, he did take his medication to Adelaide, but if he had stayed in his home and waited for the power to come back on, it would have inevitably spoiled, and A, he would have been placed in a life-threatening position, but B, he would have been out of pocket for what is a rather expensive medication that he needs, it's not a choice, he needs to survive. So in that setting, I think that this compensatory scheme should be expanded to include people like Adam so that they can claim compensation and replace, if there is loss, that medication. The second example I'd like to draw to people's attention is the Middleton Bakery. Now this was an infamous example at the time. Luke Martin and his wonderful wife did a number of interviews on radio and associated mediums to share the plight of our businesses in our region at that time. But, Mr. Speaker, they were faced with a terrible dilemma. The power was out quite early in the morning, and they were faced with a choice about whether to call their bakers in to get started on working, and I think they did from memory. So they've called them in, had some wage bill that they had to cover. They then lost quite a bit of stock from their fridge, which left them with a rather hefty bill, and so on and so on. So that business was out of pocket quite some as a result of the power outage and the uncertainty about whether it would come back on. And they were not alone. There was many businesses that rely on refrigeration and other electrically powered machinery to keep their businesses running who were out of pocket as a result of this power outage. They should, in my view, be eligible for compensation as a part of this or a similar scheme, so that when and if this happens again, they are not out of pocket, because ultimately it happened through no fault of their own. And I'd like to pick up on a point that arose in the media release that the government disseminated celebrating the Small Claims Compensation Scheme and its virtues. It is designed to address a gap in the wider insurance market. That is exactly what we have found in the aftermath of the power outage. There have been very precious few insurers that are willing to pay out insurance claims for loss as a result of this power outage. We are finding that most are getting rejected on account of it being not eligible under the terms and conditions that have been imposed upon them by their insurers. So if that is a virtuous enough reason to establish this small claims scheme in the first place, for that specific reason of voltage variation, would it not be the same for a power outage? If there is a gap in the insurance market that is leaving these businesses and individuals out of pocket through no fault of their own, and the insurers aren't coming to the party to fill that gap, then perhaps this scheme, and I submit that this scheme should be expanded to include it. So that's what I'll be seeking to do today. And by way of explanation of the bill, it is very simple. It literally just expands that scheme to include power outages. Now, not just every power outage, this specifically includes unplanned outages that last for 8 hours or more, Mr. Speaker. And I have to tell you that as an independent member of Parliament, without the means of a bureaucracy or party behind me, I didn't have a great deal of support in coming up with this bill, so 8 hours is a rather arbitrary number. We have reached that number because we've roughly estimated that that's how long food might well last in a freezer without power on with the door shut. But, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make clear to this Parliament and to any stakeholders and constituents of mine that might be listening, that now that this bill has been tabled, I'm very much open to assistance from the government, from stakeholders, from the community, as to how it might best work. I think this scheme should be inclusive of the sorts of perils that I've just mentioned. But as I said, as an independent member of Parliament, I have limited means at my disposal. And now that this bill is on the table, I'm more than open to suggestions and input and feedback from different people as to what that time duration should be and what the triggers and thresholds should be to meet them. So it's basically open for consultation now, Mr. Speaker. I'm open to changing it and working with the government and opposition and anyone else to ensure that it gets passed, because in my view, the most important thing that we could do is to fix this gap. It's a gap that we've talked about the guaranteed service levels, that doesn't apply. We've talked about the small claims compensation scheme, that doesn't seem to apply. And we've talked about the fact that the insurance companies don't seem to be coming to the party to cover those gaps either. So when a business or individual is left out of pocket, is facing significant financial hardship through no fault of their own, that is an issue that should be redressed, and I'm seeking to do that. So I don't think it should necessitate the increase in power prices. I think that we already pay the exorbitant power prices that we do currently, and there should be means within those bills to ensure that our power can be kept on and those insulators can be kept clean. So I completely reject the fact that any argument put forward that this will require that power prices increase. And I'd like to think that we can get it done within the bills that we pay already. So, Mr. Acting Speaker, in conclusion, I feel that there's likely a prevailing view within government, within the bureaucracy, that when issues happen in regional South Australia and they don't affect metropolitan Adelaide, that if they sit tight long enough, they'll eventually blow over and go away. Well, this is not one that I intend to let go away. This is a terrible event that happened in our, in our region. In 2025, it should not occur. There should be no way that we are left without power for 20 hours or more in this day and age. And I intend to do something to provide compensation when it does, or if it does, but also as an imperative to the power companies to ensure that they don't let it happen. I think this stick should ensure that they take proactive measures, more so than they are doing now, to ensure that the power stays on, and the fear of having to pay out compensation will hopefully trigger some further action or more action from those companies to ensure that it does. So I commend the Build a House. I want to reiterate the fact that I'm open to working with any party or stakeholder or constituent to find the perfect model that works so that it can secure passage. I don't necessarily contend that this is, but I'd like to think that it's a good starting point and something we can work on to build a new compensatory scheme that includes this gap in the market.